Welcome to Sinister Truths, the channel where dark history, hidden stories, and unsettling realities come to light. Before we begin, let us know in the comments which country you're watching from and what time of day it is for you. And make sure to subscribe and hit the bell so you never miss a chilling story. Smoky Mountains, 1850. The mist came first, long before the sun. It crept through the valleys like a living thing, thick and cold, coiling around the trunks of ancient hemlocks and white oaks. It muffled sound, swallowed distance, and blurred the line between earth and sky. In the Smoky Mountains, the fog was not weather. It was law. It decided who could be seen, who could be heard, and who would vanish without a trace. A lone figure moved within it. He walked without haste, boots worn thin but steady against the leaf-soaked ground. His breathing was slow, measured, barely disturbing the damp air. Every step fell where it must, on stone instead of twig, on packed earth instead of loose leaves. To an untrained eye, the forest appeared empty. To the mountains, the man belonged. His name was Elias. A heavy iron shackle circled his left ankle, the chain cut short years ago so it would not catch on roots. The metal was dark with rust and old blood. It made no sound when he walked. Elias had learned how to move so that it never would. He carried a rifle across his back, older than most men, the stock smoothed by decades of hands. A knife rested at his hip, its handle wrapped in deer hide. His clothes were patched buckskin and faded wool, marked by weather and time rather than fashion. If not for the iron, he could have passed for any free mountain man, another trapper moving with the dawn. But Elias was not free. He had been born a slave on a lowland plantation far east of the mountains, where the air was heavy and the soil bled cotton. He had been 12 when the trader first saw him, tall for his age, strong-armed, eyes that never dropped. The man had paid good money and taken Elias west, into colder air and harder country, where fur fetched higher prices than sugar or tobacco. The trader called himself Elias's owner. The mountains never did. The Smokies rose like a wall before him, their ridges layered blue upon blue, endless and ancient. Elias had learned every fold of them the hard way, through winters that froze breath into ice and summers thick with insects and fever. He had trapped beaver in half-frozen streams, skinned elk beneath snowfall, buried men whose names the forest erased within a season. He had learned the mountain language, the scrape of bark that meant a bear had passed, the silence that meant something worse waited ahead, the way birds fled uphill when men with guns moved below. That morning, the signs were wrong, too quiet, too still. Elias stopped beside a moss-covered boulder and crouched, pressing his palm to the ground. The soil was damp but recently disturbed. Hoof prints cut through the mud, horses shod iron careless, men who did not know how loud they were, hunters, not the kind who chased deer, the kind who chased people. He closed his eyes for a moment, listening. Somewhere downhill, metal clinked. A voice laughed, short, sharp, cruel. Another answered it, carrying the flat twang of the low country. SL. Hunters had come into the mountains. They always did, sooner or later. Runaways fled uphill because they believed the mountains meant freedom. Sometimes they were right. Sometimes the forest swallowed them whole. And sometimes men followed with dogs, chains, and blood in their pockets. Elias rose slowly and turned toward the sound. He did not run. Running was for men who did not know where every path led. They found him near a narrow creek, where water slid quietly over stone. 5 white men on horseback, coats dark with travel, rifles resting easy across saddles. One carried a whip coiled at his side. Another had dogs, lean scarred hounds straining against their leashes, noses already testing the air. The leader dismounted first. He was tall, broad-shouldered, his beard shot with gray. His eyes were sharp, calculating, and settled on Elias with immediate possession. He looked at the shackle, then the rifle. "Well now," the man said, smiling thinly, "ain't this a sight?" Elias inclined his head, not submissive, not defiant. Just enough. "Mornin'," he said. "You belong to someone?" the man asked, already knowing the answer. Elias did not lie. Lying wasted breath. "I work for Harlan Crow, fur trader, camps North Ridge in winter." The name meant something. Crow was known hard, greedy, careless with lives, but careful with money. The leader nodded. "You mountain boys always end up owned by someone," he said, "even when you don't know it." He stepped closer, boots sinking into mud. "Name's Cutter. We're huntin'." Elias said nothing. Cutter's gaze slid past him up toward the ridgeline. Got word there's 3 runaways holed up high country. Man, woman, maybe a boy. Been eluding folks for weeks. The dogs growled softly. You know these woods, Cutter said. Better than most. You'll guide us. It was not a question. Elias met his eyes. Crow didn't say. Cutter backhanded him. The blow split skin and tasted of iron. Elias staggered but did not fall. The dogs barked, excited. Cutter leaned in close. Crow don't own you today, he said quietly. We do. A chain was produced, heavier than the one already on Elias's ankle. It was snapped around his wrist and tied to a saddle horn. The mountains watched. They moved uphill. The hunters rode carelessly, branches snapping beneath hooves, voices loud in the mist. Elias walked ahead, chain slack but present, every step measured. He could feel the dog's eyes on him, the men's impatience behind him. Inside, his mind was already working. He marked every ridge, every crossing. He knew where the ground gave way suddenly, where old bear pits lay half-hidden beneath leaves. He knew where streams swelled fast after rain, where paths narrowed to knife-edge ledges. He also knew where people hid. The runaways would be terrified. Hungry, cold, they would have made mistakes. Fires too smoky, tracks too deep. But they might still live if the hunters never reached them. Elias adjusted his path just slightly, leading the men toward higher ground than necessary, away from the quickest route. Not enough to raise suspicion, just enough to begin. Behind him, Cutter spoke to his men. Once we find 'em, he said, boy's worth less. Woman'll fetch more alive, man depends. Someone laughed. Elias said nothing. His silence was not obedience, it was patience. By mid-morning the fog thickened, visibility dropped to 20 feet. Sound bent strangely, voices seemed closer, footsteps farther away. The dogs pulled hard, confused by damp air and overlapping scents. Cutter frowned. You sure this is the way? Elias stopped and turned. High country's always this way, he said evenly. Mountain don't care what you want. Cutter studied him, then spat. Keep moving. They pressed on. Above them, unseen, a raven cried once and flew. Elias remembered the first winter he had nearly died. He had been 16, sent out alone to check traps in a storm that swallowed trails whole. He had fallen through ice into black water and clawed his way out half frozen. He had crawled into a hollow log and waited 3 days, rationing breath, listening to wolves pass within arm's reach. The mountains had tested him. He had survived. These men did not belong here. The Smokies did not forgive ignorance. As noon approached, the ground steepened sharply. Loose shale slid underfoot. Horses snorted, uneasy. Elias slowed deliberately. What's wrong? Cutter barked. Trail narrows, Elias said. Best dismount soon. Cutter hesitated, then waved the men down. They tied the horses and continued on foot, cursing under their breath. The chain between Elias and the saddle was removed, but the wrist shackle remained. He led them into the mist, and with every step the trap began to close. By the time the fog began to thin, the hunters had already made their first mistake. They believed they were in control. The mountain slope rose before them like a wall, uneven and slick with damp stone. What little sunlight pierced the mist came fractured, slanting through branches heavy with moss. The air smelled of wet bark and cold earth. It was the kind of place where sound carried strangely, where a cough might echo like a gunshot, and a whisper might vanish entirely. Elias moved ahead of them, his figure half swallowed by drifting fog. The iron cuff at his wrist was still locked, its weight familiar enough now that he barely felt it. The chain no longer tethered him to a saddle, but it tethered him all the same, to the men behind him, to their rifles, to the idea that they owned the direction of his steps. They did not. Cutter watched him closely. The hunter's boots were expensive, leather, ill-suited for shale and roots. His coat was heavy, stitched in Charleston, not made for mountain cold. He carried himself like a man accustomed to being obeyed, shoulders back, chin high, eyes sharp but impatient. Behind him came the others. There was Wade, thin and twitchy, with a scar pulling one side of his mouth into a permanent sneer. He kept his rifle too close to Elias's spine, finger always near the trigger. Wade was afraid, though he would never admit it. Fear made him dangerous. Hollis followed, broad, red-faced, breathing harder with every step. He cursed the terrain openly, complained about the cold, the fog, the silence. He would be the first to panic when things went wrong. Then there were the twins, Mark and Miles Granger, identical in build, but not in temperament. Mark laughed too easily, even now, making jokes about catching mountain ghosts. Miles said nothing at all. his eyes scanning the trees with an intensity that suggested he knew how close death often hid. And finally, the dogs. 3 of them, lean, yellow-eyed hounds with scarred flanks and raw throats. Their chains rattled softly, noses low, drawing breath from the ground itself. They were the only ones who belonged here, even less than the men. Elias listened to them all. He listened the way he always had, not just with ears but with memory. They had forced him to guide them at gunpoint, but Cutter had been careful to cloak the order in practicality. "You don't do what we say," Cutter had told him earlier as they set out, "and we leave you here with the dogs. Simple." Elias had nodded, eyes lowered. The truth was they did not need to threaten him. He knew exactly what these men did to people like him. He had seen it. Bodies strung from trees as warnings, feet cut to prevent running, children sold away before they learned their own names. He also knew something else. These men did not know the mountains, and ignorance was a sharper blade than cruelty. The path Elias chose wound sideways across the slope instead of climbing directly. To a hunter who understood the land, it would seem inefficient. To men who wanted speed, it felt wrong. "Why we headin' sideways?" Hollis demanded after an hour. Elias did not stop walking. "Wind's wrong uphill. Dogs'll lose scent. Tracks won't hold." Cutter considered this, then nodded once. Makes sense. It did not entirely. But it sounded right enough. That was Elias's gift. He knew which truths to bend without breaking. As they walked, he noted how the men spaced themselves. Wade stayed close. Cutter hung back slightly, preferring a view of everyone. The twins flanked wide, scanning the trees. Hollis lagged. Patterns formed quickly when men believed they were hunting. Elias counted their breaths. He noted which boots slipped and which held, which men watched him, and which stopped watching when they thought they had learned his rhythm. They had not. By midday, the fog burned away in patches, revealing glimpses of distant ridges stacked like waves frozen in motion. The air grew warmer, but not kinder. Sweat soaked through coats. Hollis's curses turned hoarse. They stopped near a fallen chestnut for water. Cutter crouched, refilling his canteen from a stream. "You ever run?" He asked suddenly, not looking up. Elias shook his head. "Mountains are my run," Cutter snorted. "Ain't no place free for your kind." Elias said nothing. Wade laughed nervously. "Man knows his place." The dogs strained at their chains, whining. Miles Granger watched Elias over the fireless break. His gaze lingered too long. "You sure he ain't leading us wrong?" Miles said quietly. Cutter stood. "If he is, he'll pay." Elias met Miles's eyes for a fraction of a second, long enough to know the man was not stupid. Not kind either, just aware. Awareness could be handled. Stupidity was louder. They resumed the climb. Elias angled them toward a narrow ravine, its mouth obscured by undergrowth. Water trickled somewhere deep within, unseen but loud enough to mask other sounds. As they entered, the temperature dropped sharply. The walls closed in, roots twisted from rock like skeletal fingers. Wade muttered, "Don't like this." "Quiet," Cutter snapped. The dogs balked, noses lifting, uncertain. Scents tangled here, old, layered, confusing. Elias felt a flicker of satisfaction. He slowed. "Why stop?" Cutter asked. Elias crouched, pointing at the ground. "Tracks." The men crowded forward, peering uselessly. "There," Elias said. "Barefoot, small child maybe." It was a lie, but a careful one. Cutter's face hardened. "They're close." Hollis grinned, hunger replacing fatigue. "Good." Elias rose and continued deeper into the ravine. What he did not say was that this place flooded, without warning, when rain fell higher up. That the stone walls made retreat difficult. That loose rock above could shift with the wrong step. The mountains remembered every footfall. As afternoon stretched on, the men grew careless. Mark Granger began whistling. Hollis laughed louder. Cutter pushed for speed, certain now that the quarry lay ahead. They no longer questioned Elias's choices. Trust had settled, not in him, but in the idea that he was too owned to be dangerous. That belief was their second mistake. Elias led them past a stand of spruce where the ground softened deceptively. Wade slipped, catching himself on a sapling. "Damn it," Wade snarled, shoving Elias forward. "You trying to get us killed?" Elias steadied himself. "Ground's old here, washed thin." "Then why'd you—" "Because it's quieter," Elias said. "Men don't pass here unless they know it." Cutter raised a hand. "Enough." They moved on. Above them, clouds gathered unseen. As the light shifted, Elias noticed something new, A mark on a tree, subtle but deliberate. A strip of bark peeled back, forming a shape only certain eyes would notice. A warning. Someone else had passed through recently. Someone who knew the signs. Hope stirred, but Elias smothered it quickly. Hope made men careless. He adjusted his course slightly, angling the hunters away from the sign, not too sharply, just enough. Behind him the dogs howled suddenly, confused by crossing scents. "Got him!" Hollis outed. Cutter grinned. "Move." They surged forward. Elias let them. By the time the first drops of rain fell, Cutter was convinced they would have their prey before nightfall. Thunder rolled distantly. "Storm will slow 'em," Cutter said. "Good." Elias said nothing. Storms did not slow the mountains. They awakened them. The rain came hard and fast, turning dirt to slick paste. Water pooled in footprints. Visibility dropped again. The ravine darkened. Elias felt the ground shift beneath his boots, just slightly. He adjusted his weight instinctively. Behind him, Hollis slipped and fell hard, rifle clattering. "God damn it!" The dogs barked wildly. Cutter turned, irritation flaring. "Get up!" Hollis struggled, mud coating his coat. Elias stopped. "Careful," he said softly. "Rock slide country now." Cutter stared at him. "Why didn't you say that earlier?" Elias met his gaze evenly. "You didn't ask." For a moment something flickered in Cutter's eyes, suspicion, but pride won. "Move," Cutter said. Elias turned back into the rain. Inside, the trap tightened, not sprung yet, not yet. As night crept closer, the forest closed ranks around them. The hunters were tired now, wet, irritated. Their confidence had thinned, replaced by the unspoken understanding that they were far from anything familiar. And Elias, silent, steady, unbroken, walked on. He was still chained, still watched, still officially owned, but with every step deeper into the Smoky Mountains, the hunters were leaving the world they ruled and entering one that already knew his name. Night did not fall in the Smokies all at once. It crept. First the light thinned, then the shadows lengthened, then the forest seemed to inhale and hold its breath. The rain eased into a mist again, clinging to leaves and bark, turning every surface slick and dark. Water dripped steadily from branches, a patient rhythm that blurred into the sound of Elias's own footsteps. The hunters slowed as darkness gathered. They did not say it out loud, but each of them felt it, the unease that came when daylight abandoned them in unfamiliar ground. The forest had changed its posture. Where earlier it had felt merely dense, now it felt deliberate, as if it were watching. Elias sensed it too, but differently. To him, the night was not a threat. It was a language, and the mountains were speaking. They stopped near a stand of old firs, their trunks thick and scarred by centuries of storms. Cutter called for a halt, his voice sharper than before. "We camp," he said. "No sense breaking legs in the dark." Hollis sagged with relief. Wade scanned the trees nervously, rifle high. The Granger twins moved without speaking, already clearing a small space, their motions practiced but stiff. Elias stood still, rain misting his face, eyes moving. This place was wrong, not dangerous, not yet, but wrong. The ground dipped slightly toward a shallow basin, invisible in the gloom. Water would gather here. Overnight, cold would settle, fog would thicken, but Cutter had chosen it, which meant Elias would not argue. He lowered himself near a fallen log, wrists still cuffed, chain looped loosely around a root. The dogs were tied nearby, restless, noses lifting, whining softly. They could smell too much and understand too little. Cutter lit a small fire despite the damp, coaxing flame from resin-rich wood. Smoke rose thin and pale, then flattened under the weight of the mist. Miles Granger watched the smoke drift. "That'll carry," he muttered. "Let it," Cutter said. "If they see it, they'll think we're dumb." Mark chuckled. "Ain't we?" No one laughed. Elias listened, not to the men, but beyond them. The forest spoke in absences as much as sounds. No owls yet, no frogs. Even the insects were muted. Something had passed through earlier, something that unsettled the usual rhythm. He leaned forward slightly, examining the ground near the firelight's edge. A scuffed patch of earth, not booted, not bare, wrapped feet, cloth or hide. Recent. They were closer than Cutter believed. Elias lowered his gaze, hiding the knowledge. They ate salted meat and hard bread. Hollis complained about his ankle. Wade drank too much from his flask. Cutter cleaned his pistol methodically, eyes flicking now and then to Elias. "So," Cutter said eventually, "you been up here how long?" Elias shrugged. Long enough. You got family? No, a lie, but an old one. Cutter nodded as if satisfied. Funny thing, he said. Men like you, always thinking the woods make you equal. Elias said nothing. The woods don't care, Cutter continued. They kill everyone the same. That's true, Elias said quietly. Cutter smiled. Smart mouth for a slave. Elias lifted his eyes. Smart mouth keeps me alive. For a moment Cutter considered him with something close to curiosity. Then he turned away. As the fire burned lower, the men settled into uneasy rest. Wade took first watch, pacing too loudly. The dogs finally lay down, though their ears twitched constantly. Elias remained awake. Sleep was dangerous when men like these were near. He watched the fire sink into coals, watched sparks rise and vanish into the mist. He counted the seconds between Wade's steps. He mapped the camp in his mind. Who lay where, which direction the rifles pointed, where the shadows pooled deepest. And he listened. Far upslope, stone shifted. Not much. Just enough. Someone moving carefully. Elias felt a tightness in his chest. Not fear, not excitement. Responsibility. He could not warn them directly. That would cost lives, possibly his own, possibly the runaways. But he could speak to the mountain. When Wade's pacing took him away from the dogs, Elias shifted slightly, brushing his boot against a loose stone near the basin's edge. It rolled softly, drawing a trickle of water down into the low ground. By morning, this place would be a mire. He settled back, breathing slow. On came gray and cold. Fog clung to the ground like wet wool, thick enough to swallow shapes beyond a few yards. The fire was a memory now, nothing left but blackened stone and damp ash. Hollis woke cursing, his boots soaked. Damn ground turned to soup, he growled. Elias said nothing. The dogs were restless again, pulling hard on their chains, noses high now, no longer confused. They got scent, Wade said eagerly. Cutter rose, rolling his shoulders. Good, means today's the day. Elias watched the fog. Fog was a liar. It hid distance. It bent sound. It made men think they were alone when they were not. He began walking as soon as Cutter gestured him forward. The trail Elias chose now narrowed sharply, threading between boulders slick with moss. He did not slow too much, just enough that Cutter noticed the care he took. Watch your step, Elias said. This stone sweats. What? Water bleeds through it, Elias said. Looks solid, ain't? Cutter nodded grudgingly. Keep going. They climbed higher, fog thinning slightly as the ground rose. The forest changed here, more spruce, fewer broadleaf trees. The air smelled sharper, cleaner. Elias read the signs as easily as breath. A bent fern, pressed down by a knee, not a foot. A snapped twig placed deliberately back into position. Ash scattered thinly, hidden beneath pine needles. They were being careful. Too careful for people new to running. These were not desperate fools. These were survivors. Elias felt a flicker of pride he did not allow to surface. By mid-morning, Cutter grew impatient. We're circling, he snapped. I don't like it. Elias stopped at the edge of a narrow ledge, no wider than a wagon wheel, the ground dropping sharply on one side into mist. They doubled back, Elias said. Smart, used water to break scent. Wade scowled. Dogs ain't lost it. No, Elias agreed. They won't, but men do. Cutter studied the ledge, the drop, the fog below. His jaw tightened. You sure you ain't leading us into a hole? Elias turned slowly. You brought me because I know these signs. If you don't trust me, shoot me and guess the rest. Silence. Rain began again, light but steady. Cutter cursed under his breath. Move. Elias stepped onto the ledge. He knew this place well, knew where the stone crumbled under weight, knew where one wrong step meant a long fall and a short life. He placed his feet carefully. Behind him, Wade slipped once, arms flailing, catching himself only because Mark grabbed his coat. Careful, Mark hissed. Fear crept closer now, tangible. Good. At the ledge's end, Elias paused again. Below, hidden by fog, lay an old game trail leading into a ravine choked with deadfall. Narrow, confusing, perfect, he pointed. They went down. Cutter hesitated. Miles Granger leaned forward, squinting. Tracks make sense. They did, because Elias had made sure of that earlier, scuffing earth just enough, bending grass the right way. Cutter nod. Down, then. They descended. The ravine swallowed them whole. Inside it, sound died. Water dripped constantly. Roots tangled overhead. Fallen trees lay like barricades, forcing single-file movement. Elias moved first, ducking, weaving, never hesitating. Behind him, the men struggled. Hollis banged his knee hard and bit back a scream. Mark laughed too loudly to cover his nerves. Wade's breathing grew ragged. Miles said nothing, but his eyes never stopped moving. Elias sensed him watching more closely. Now, good. Let him see. Let him doubt. The ravine twisted sharply, then narrowed to a choke point where two boulders leaned together, leaving a crawl space beneath. Elias dropped to one knee. "Through here," he said. Cutter stared. "You expect us to crawl?" Elias nodded. "Unless you want to climb. Straight up wet rock." Cutter cursed again, then gestured. "Go." Elias ducked under the stone, moving easily. Behind him, one by one, the hunters followed. The dogs could not. They barked wildly, chains pulling taut. Cutter swore. "Leave 'em. We'll come back." Elias hid his smile. Beyond the choke point, the ravine opened slightly, just enough. Elias stopped. He bent, examining the ground with exaggerated care. "Found 'em?" Wade whispered. Elias shook his head. "No." He straightened slowly. "They found us." Before Cutter could speak, a stone clattered from above, then another, small, deliberate, a warning. Cutter spun, rifle up. "Where?" The forest did not answer, but it listened. Elias stepped back into shadow, heart steady. The signs were everywhere now, signs only he could read. And the mountains were ready. The Smokies did not announce their wrath, no booming thunder or howling wind marked. The moment, there was only the quiet shift of earth beneath careless feet, the small, almost invisible betrayals of stone and soil. Elias knew this. He had lived long enough in the mountains to recognize the signs of danger, the subtle hints that most men ignored. A loosened rock here, a displaced branch there, the echo of water moving differently. By morning, everything seemed ordinary. By nightfall, ordinary had become deadly. The hunters did not see it coming. They had followed Elias deeper into the ravine. The narrow choke points, the hidden bends, the deceptive ledges, all of it had lulled them into a false rhythm. Their confidence, already fragile, now pressed outward like a balloon stretched too thin. Hollis complained constantly. Mark whistled nervously, and Wade muttered darkly under his breath as he stumbled over roots slick with mist. Cutter tried to maintain control, his rifle ready, his eyes scanning constantly, but he too was beginning to feel the mountain pressing in. Elias walked ahead, calm, silent, imagining each step as a line in a trap he had been setting for hours. The first warning came quietly, a faint shift of gravel above them. A noise almost too soft to hear, like the whisper of a ghost. Elias used, barely, and crouched low. He bent down to examine the soil, noting the subtle displacement of rocks. "Careful," he muttered, more to himself than to Cutter. "What?" Cutter barked, irritation sharpening his tone. "Stone moves easy here," Elias said, straightening slowly. "Step wrong, you'll slide." The hunters laughed nervously, dismissing it as mountain superstition. They were too confident, or too unaware, to see the danger. Elias moved again, stepping precisely where he knew the ground would hold. Behind him, the hunters followed blindly, the chain at his wrist slack but omnipresent. The ravine widened slightly, revealing a sharp incline with loose shale. A waterfall tumbled somewhere above, hidden in mist. Elias slowed, glancing upward. This was it, the first part of the trap. He could feel the weight of rocks above him, the way they shifted minutely with wind and moisture. Cutter led the men with his usual arrogance, stepping quickly, rifle in hand, expecting obedience and speed. Wade followed carelessly, grumbling about slow movement, his eyes flicking impatiently to the path ahead. Hollis was distracted, adjusting his pack and muttering about wet boots. Mark and Miles grinned too easily, the twins' bravado shielding them from subtle fear. And Elias? Elias watched. He waited. A single motion, almost imperceptible, was all it took. Elias shifted a loose stone with the toe of his boot. It slid down the incline, striking another rock below. The noise was soft, drowned out by the sound of the waterfall and the rush of the mountain air. But it was enough. The first hunter's foot caught in the wrong place. The shale gave way. Cutter lunged instinctively, grabbing Wade to steady him, but it was too late. A section of loose rock, balanced just enough to look solid, slipped. The cascade tumbled down the slope. Gravel and stones rained over the hunters, striking boots, splashing in mud, clattering against the boulders like thunder in miniature. Hollis screamed, hopping to avoid the falling stones. Wade stumbled, cursing loudly. a stone grazing his shoulder and drawing blood. Cutter cursed in disbelief, his commanding voice swallowed by the avalanche of rock. The dogs barked, straining at their chains, confused and alarmed. Elias crouched low behind a tree, chest steady, eyes fixed on the chaos. Not a scratch had touched him. Every rock, every shift in the slope had been anticipated. When the dust settled, the hunters were shaken. "Damn it," Hollis spat, his face streaked with mud. "We're pinned." Cutter's pride flared. "No, move, move." But Elias had chosen this section carefully. The slope above was now a minefield of unstable rock. Each step the hunters took threatened to trigger another cascade. The only safe ground was where Elias had walked. He stood slowly, letting the hunters' panic rise. "Careful," he said again. "Mountain doesn't forgive mistakes." Wade looked at him, rage and fear mixing in his eyes. "You," he began. But Cutter cut him off with a barked command. "Shut it, move." They stepped carefully, but already doubt had crept in. Panic slowed them. Every loose stone underfoot made their movements hesitant, awkward, dangerous. The mountain took note, and Elias felt the thrill of knowing that nature itself had become an ally. The first casualty was small but shocking. Hollis had tried to leap over a patch of shale. The stone beneath him shifted violently, sending him sliding down the slope. He struck a boulder, rolled, and came to a halt halfway down the incline, winded and bruised. A scream tore from him before he realized the fall had spared him more serious injury. Cutter rushed to help him, but the rocks had loosened further. Another slide tumbled down. Cutter barely grabbed the roots above him, straining against the pull of gravity. Wade scrambled, cursing the entire time, while Mark and Miles hesitated. Frozen. Elias stepped forward finally, his voice calm, controlled. "Hold the trees," he said. "Every step counts." As a thin mask over fear. "Damn mountain," he muttered. "We're lucky to be alive." Wade spat blood from a cut lip. "Lucky? This is just the beginning." Hollis leaned against a tree, swearing under his breath, his ankle bruised and bleeding. Mark and Miles were pale, eyes wide, shaking. Elias approached, calm, deliberate, his presence a contrast to their chaos. "You were careless," he said quietly. "You ignored the signs. You did not watch the ground. You moved too fast. The mountain does not forgive mistakes like that." Cutter's jaw tightened. "And you," he began. Elias held up a hand. "I do not attack, I guide. You brought yourselves here. Nature did the rest." The hunter's shoulders slumped in silent acknowledgement. They had underestimated him. They had underestimated the land. By nightfall, the hunters had made a makeshift camp, nursing injuries and bruised egos. Elias crouched at the edge of the firelight, chain still around his wrist, the weight heavy but meaningless compared to what had just happened. He knew the mountain had marked its first victory, and he knew this was only the beginning. The forest around them was alive, listening, patient. Every ridge, every stone, every whisper of wind conspired to turn the hunter's hunt into a lesson. Elias allowed himself a small, private satisfaction. They had walked into his trap, and he had only begun to show them the cost of underestimating the mountain, and the man who knew its secrets. Hunger is a quiet thief. It does not roar. It does not demand attention. It creeps, infiltrating thoughts, breaking resolve, twisting reason into suspicion. In the Smoky Mountains, hunger was a companion for those unprepared for the cold, the steep slopes, and the wet stone. For the hunters it had arrived slowly, imperceptibly, until they were already weakened, exposed, and vulnerable. Elias noticed every nuance. The morning after the first trap, the hunters awoke bruised, weary, and wet. Their fire had mostly burned to ash. Rain had seeped into their clothing overnight, soaking packs, boots, and pride alike. Hollis's ankle throbbed, Wade's shoulder bled, and Cutter's temper had grown shorter with each breath. The chains at Elias's wrist felt lighter than yesterday, but the weight of expectation pressed more heavily than iron. The men believed they controlled him. They did not. Elias watched them eat cold bread and scraps of salted meat. There was no warmth in the meal, only necessity. Cutter bit into a piece of jerky with forced satisfaction. Hollis picked at it, complaining under his breath. Wade had lost appetite entirely, scowling at the moisture-laden bread. Even the twins, Mark and Miles, chewed mechanically, their eyes darting to every shadow as though expecting ambush. And the forest listened. Elias had led them uphill, further from any clear path or supply line. Streams appeared sporadically, water cold, muddied, and difficult to reach without losing balance. Food was scarce. The streams teeming with slippery rocks. The hunter's arrogance from the previous day had been replaced by fatigue. Confidence had been replaced by doubt. "You moved slow yesterday," Cutter said, breaking the silence as he inspected the narrow ledge they had climbed. "We could have found him faster if we didn't." Elias stopped him with a calm glance. "Faster is not safer." Cutter's jaw tightened. "I don't like safer. I like results." "Results are what come from careful steps," Elias replied. His voice was quiet, measured. Each word was a challenge wrapped in civility. Cutter's eyes flicked to the chain. The man wanted to assert dominance. But here, in the mountains, dominance was a matter of knowledge, not muscle. By midday, hunger had begun to gnaw. The hunter's nerves frayed with every footfall on wet stone. Wade muttered curses, blaming Elias for slowing the pace. Hollis bickered with the twins over how to ration the remaining jerky. Cutter's face darkened with every complaint, every misstep, every hesitation. Elias noted everything. He observed who grew pale first, who began to sweat despite the cold, who whispered accusations under their breath. The first fracture appeared between Mark and Miles. A slip on mossy stone had nearly sent Mark tumbling into a shallow ravine. Miles reached out to steady him, but Mark lashed out, shoving his twin. "You're always watching me," Mark shouted. "I'm trying to keep you alive," Miles shot back. Hollis laughed nervously, though no one joined him. Wade spat into the mud, muttering about twins and fools. Cutter's eyes narrowed, a vein pulsing at his temple. "Enough," Cutter roared. "We have a job. Stop squabbling and follow the trail." The trail, Elias knew, led into deeper confusion. The forest around them became a silent accomplice. Roots twisted beneath boots. Rocks slid unexpectedly. Branches broke with a sharp crack that made hearts jump. Mist hung low, obscuring distance and hiding the faintest clue of pursuit. Birds remained silent. No squirrels darted. Only the faint rush of water echoed through the hollows. Elias led them carefully, deliberately. Every misstep the hunters made, every hesitant movement, every fearful glance, reinforced the mountain's authority. They were beginning to understand, too late, that the forest had a language, and they could not read it. By late afternoon, hunger began to dominate thought. Hollis was the first to break entirely. He dropped his pack, swearing, and tore at the remaining jerky with shaking hands. "I'm sick of this," he shouted. "We're dying out here while that son of a bitch leads us in circles." Wade's eyes flicked to Elias, narrowed with growing suspicion. "He's doing it on purpose," Wade said. "He's leading us wrong." Cutter's face turned red. "Shut your mouth." Miles Granger muttered something under his breath. Mark laughed nervously, unsure whether to join in or remain silent. Elias remained calm, letting the chaos rise around him. He did know. T respond. Argument and fear were weapons far more effective than violence here. The mountain had already begun to turn their own nerves against them. Night approached slowly. The hunters set a makeshift camp in a small clearing. Mist thickened, water dripped steadily from the branches. They lit a small fire, more to warm their hands than to illuminate the night. Food was almost gone. Water, though present in the stream nearby, required careful footing and effort to reach. Cutter inspected the men like a commander assessing troops on the verge of mutiny. "Tomorrow we push through. No more mistakes. No more hesitation. We're going to find them or die trying," Hollis grumbled. Wade spat again. Mark and Miles glared at each other. Elias knelt near the firelight's edge, eyes scanning the perimeter, hands free despite the wrist chain. The forest hummed with quiet threats. He could see the faint impressions of someone, or something, moving above the ridge earlier, leaving subtle traces on the soil. A warning. Sleep was impossible. The hunters tried to rest, but the weight of fear and hunger kept them awake. Every crack of a branch made them start. Every rustle of wind through the trees seemed like a footstep. Hollis's ankle throbbed painfully. Wade's shoulder was swollen. Cutter paced, muttering under his breath. The twins whispered among themselves, too quietly for Elias to hear, their faces pale in the firelight. Elias remained still. He listened, he calculated, he planned. The first mistakes of the day had been minor. The second day promised more. Hunger would make the hunters careless. Fatigue would make them argue. Fear would make them turn on each other. All Elias had to do was wait. By early morning, the hunters' nerves had frayed completely. Hollis accused Mark of stealing the last morsel of jerky. Wade accused Miles of slowing the pace intentionally. Cutter's patience, already thin, snapped completely. "You're all fools," he shouted. "We've got the trail, we've got the chain, we've got him. Stop arguing and move." Elias remained calm, watching. He noticed that Cutter's eyes flicked repeatedly to him, a mixture of fear and frustration. The hunter did not trust him, but neither could he act without him. The forest, thick with fog and mist, seemed to lean closer. Every sound was amplified. Every shadow seemed to move. The hunters imagined movement where there was none. Elias smiled faintly, inwardly. The traps were subtle, rocks arranged to shift under weight, branches bent to guide footsteps, muddy patches designed to slide, water trickling in unpredictable patterns to mask faint traces. Elias had been leading them carefully for 2 days, and the results were clear. Confidence had been replaced by doubt. Doubt by irritation. Irritation by paranoia. Wade glared at Elias. "I don't trust him," he muttered. He's... Quiet, Cutter snapped, but the seed had been planted. Suspicion now moved like wildfire through the group. Every glance was measured, every misstep attributed to intentional sabotage. Elias allowed it. By afternoon, the hunters were starving. The last scraps of food were gone. Water had to be collected from a trickling stream, requiring careful balance. Hollis's ankle was swollen. Wade's shoulder was stiff. Mark and Miles were pale and jittery. Cutter's face was drawn and pale, hands shaking slightly as he handled his rifle. Hunger had done its work, and Elias had not lifted a finger. That night they camped on a narrow ledge, the cliff falling away sharply behind them. Fog crept along the mountainside, hiding the depths below. No one slept well. Every sound, the drip of water, the scuff of leaves, the distant cry of a bird, set nerves jangling. Cutter paced, muttering about mistakes. Hollis cursed every step of the way. Wade muttered again about Elias. The twins whispered, eyes wide. Elias knelt in shadow, observing. His heart was calm. Hunger, fear, exhaustion, all were weapons he did not need to wield directly. The mountain itself had begun to teach the hunters lessons, and the lessons were harsh. By dawn, the hunters were broken in ways Elias had anticipated. They moved cautiously, suspiciously, every step measured, every glance over the shoulder. The mountain had taught them humility. Hunger had taught them desperation. Fear had taught them distrust. And Elias, chained yet free in ways the men could not perceive, walked among them like a shadow of inevitability. The hunt had begun to turn. And soon the hunters would discover they were not the hunters at all. They were the hunted. The forest had claimed its first victories. By the 3rd day, the hunters were no longer confident men. They were ragged shadows of arrogance, moving through the mist as if every tree and stone might betray them. Cuts, bruises, and exhaustion marked their bodies. Their nerves were raw, sharpened by hunger and uncertainty. Their trust in each other had eroded, and their trust in Elias, thin to begin with, had been replaced by fear. He had not attacked them once. He had not raised a hand. He had simply guided them into a landscape they could not read. And now, the mountain itself would begin to hunt them. Elias had been planning this moment from the start. Every branch bent, every loose stone, every misleading path, all had been placed to disorient and isolate. Now the hunters were physically and mentally vulnerable. Mist hung thick in the ravines, muffling sound, obscuring sight, and amplifying every imagined movement. The forest felt alive, breathing, aware. Every animal, every shift of wind, every drop of water played a part in the trap. He moved deliberately ahead of them, aware of every misstep, every breath, every glance over a shoulder. His chain at the wrist rattled softly as he adjusted it, a subtle reminder of his captivity, but it meant nothing. The hunters had no idea how free he truly was. The first hunter to fall was Wade. It happened in a section of trail that seemed harmless at first glance, a narrow path along a slope of loose shale, bordered on one side by a steep drop and on the other by thick undergrowth. Elias walked carefully, planting his boots on solid rock, feeling the subtle give of the ground beneath. Behind him, Wade followed, eyes narrowed and tongue sharp with accusation. "Step faster," Wade barked. "We're wasting daylight." Elias did not respond. A small, deliberate shift of a stone previously loosened by him sent gravel sliding beneath Wade's feet. He stumbled, flailing, arms grasping at air, trying to regain balance. One foot caught a hidden patch of mud. He slipped. The fall was short but violent. He struck the ground hard, twisting his ankle, scraping his hands, and crashing into underbrush. A loud cry tore from him, sharp enough to make the dogs bark in confusion. The other hunters froze, fear immediately replacing anger. Cutter cursed, rushing to Wade's side, but the slope above them gave way again with a rumble of stones. Elias crouched behind a tree, chest steady, eyes calm. The mountain had done the work. He had only guided it. The second trap was subtle, designed to exploit paranoia. Elias led the hunters along a narrow ridge, barely wider than a man's shoulders. On one side, sheer drops descended into the mist, cliffs carved by centuries of rain. On the other, thick undergrowth and jagged rock formed a natural wall. He walked with a quiet authority, pausing only when absolutely necessary, as though he were unsure himself. Cutter followed closely, rifle ready. Behind him, Hollis grumbled, muttering about slippery ground, while Mark and Miles flanked the sides, scanning the trees nervously. Elias's plan was simple. The ridge was unstable. Sections of rock had been previously loosened by him, carefully placed to slide under weight. The mist obscured the edges. A single misstep could send a man sliding into the ravine below, or worse, into the path of the next falling rock. He paused near a bend. "Careful here," he said softly. Cutter didn't hear the subtle warning. Hollis slipped. Mark grabbed him. Miles cursed. Gravel tumbled over the edge, striking nothing but empty air, but the sound echoed through the ravine like cannon fire. Fear had returned. Not for what had happened, but for what might happen next. Elias allowed it to grow. The hunters were isolated. By now distrust had taken root. Hollis accused Mark of deliberately leaning on him. Mark accused Miles. Wade accused everyone, and Cutter's shouts could not restore confidence. Each misstep, each nervous glance, each startled reaction reinforced their paranoia. The forest seemed to close in, amplifying every movement, every rustle, every faint sound. Elias knew exactly how fragile their minds had become. "Keep moving," he said quietly, barely audible over the mist. They obeyed, but mechanically, fear now dictating every step. By midday, the traps escalated. A fallen log placed with care created a false sense of stability. Wade, already injured from the first fall, stepped on it carelessly. The log rolled, sending him sprawling into the mud, bruising his ribs and tearing his coat. Hollis lunged to help him and nearly slipped himself, catching only a low-hanging branch. Mark and Miles were shouting at each other now, blaming one another for every mistake. Cutter's voice was hoarse, from shouting orders, no longer commanding but begging. Elias walked silently between them, guiding them along paths that seemed logical but led them deeper into confusion. He kept them moving, careful never to reveal his true understanding of the mountain, and the forest obeyed. The third trap was more deliberate, almost theatrical. Elias led the hunters to a small gorge, hidden by thick spruce and moss-covered boulders. Water trickled from above, pooling in shallow basins, making the ground slick. At first glance, the path seemed simple, a clear descent to lower ground. But Elias had prepared the gorge carefully. Loose stones lined the path, hidden under moss and wet leaves. He had weakened the banks slightly with small rock placements earlier in the season. One wrong step would set off a small landslide, enough to scare, disorient, or injure, but not enough to be fatal immediately. Hollis stepped first. A stone shifted beneath his boot. He cried out, scrambling to regain balance. Gravel slid under his feet, cascading down the slope with a loud rumble. He caught himself only by grabbing a branch. Wade stepped next, trying to move faster. The rocks beneath him shifted violently. He stumbled, arms flailing, and hit the ground hard. Pain flashed across his face, fear overtaking rage. Cutter tried to move quickly, shouting, "Watch your step." Mark and Miles froze at the sudden chaos. One more misstep and another cascade of stones rumbled down the gorge, striking none of them directly but shaking their confidence. Elias moved silently along the edge, observing. The forest was alive with sound, stones tumbling, water trickling, wind whispering. Every sensory detail magnified the hunters' fear. By afternoon, the hunters were exhausted, injured, and paranoid. Hunger gnawed at their bellies. Fatigue weighed heavily on their muscles. Every shadow seemed alive. Every sound suggested pursuit. Every movement was suspect. Elias did not need to push them further. Nature had taken over. The traps had forced the hunters into a rhythm dictated by fear. They no longer acted as a unit. They argued constantly. They doubted themselves and each other. "Move faster," Cutter shouted, frustration breaking through. "We're wasting daylight." "You're not thinking straight," Wade snapped, voice shaking. "This mountain's trying to kill us." Hollis muttered curses under his breath, swearing that the slave led us wrong on purpose. Mark and Miles argued quietly but intensely, blaming each other for every misstep. Elias walked silently among them, a calm shadow, observing the unraveling. By evening, Elias set the final subtle trap for the day. He led the hunters to a ridge that overlooked a small valley, hidden from the rest of the forest by thick pine and mist. The ridge appeared solid, but Elias had prepped the ground carefully. A small landslide was ready, loose soil and stone hidden beneath leaves. A single footfall in the wrong spot would send stones tumbling down the slope, startling the hunters and isolating them. Cutter moved first, confident. Wade followed. Hollis trailed, complaining. Mark and Miles flanked the sides, scanning nervously. Elias walked just behind, observing. The first stone slipped beneath Cutter's boot. A cascade of gravel and rocks tumbled down into the valley below, striking nothing but echoing loudly. Cutter flinched. Wade cursed. Hollis jumped back. Mark and Miles clutched at each other, eyes wide. Fear had reached a new level. Paranoia was complete. The hunters were no longer confident men, they were prey. Elias's heart was steady. His breathing was calm. The mountain had become the weapon, and he had become its master. Night fell with heavy mist and silence. The hunters made a small shaky camp on the ridge. Their fire struggled against damp wood. Cutter inspected wounds. Wade groaned, nursing bruises. Hollis complained. The twins whispered, eyes wide with fear. Elias remained at the edge of the clearing, chain on his wrist, observing, listening. He knew the hunters were broken in ways they did not yet understand. The forest had taught them lessons in humility, patience, and fear. Tomorrow he would begin the next stage. The hunters had become prey, and Elias, the chained, silent shadow of the Smokies, would continue to guide them into the mountain's design. The forest had won. By the fourth day, only one of the hunters retained a semblance of control. Cutter moved like a man teetering on the edge of reason. His rifle, once a symbol of authority, now felt like a burden, a reminder of the countless missteps and bruises that had brought him here. The others had broken completely. Hollis's ankle useless, Wade nearly unconscious from exhaustion, Mark and Miles reduced to fearful murmurs, whispering to each other as though words could make the mountain's weight less real. And Elias moved among them, bound at the wrist but free in every way that mattered. The forest had become his ally, the mountains his instrument. Every slope, every stone, every fallen tree was part of the trap. Every gust of wind carried warnings only he could read. Every subtle shift of light and shadow was an advantage Cutter did not yet understand. The morning arrived heavy with fog. Mist clung to every branch and needle, softening edges and obscuring the depth of the valleys below. The mountain seemed to breathe, the air thick and electric. Cutter moved stiffly, rifle at the ready, eyes scanning for movement that was not there. His men were gone, some literally, some in spirit, and he was. Left with only Elias, the one man who had guided them through every trap, every collapse, every misstep. The irony was unbearable. Cutter's pride demanded authority. His survival demanded obedience, and yet he could not act without the knowledge that Elias possessed. The first step toward the final reckoning was psychological. Elias allowed Cutter to feel in control, even as the mountain dictated every movement. He spoke softly, carefully, revealing enough truth to reinforce Cutter's reliance on him. "You'll need to watch your footing," Elias said quietly, nodding toward a narrow ridge barely visible through the mist. "One wrong step, and you'll fall." Cutter's jaw tightened. "I don't need your warnings," he said. "Move." Elias obeyed, stepping ahead as though he were following, while Cutter assumed leadership, unaware that he was moving exactly where Elias had planned. The ridge was narrow, bordered by sheer drops on one side and a wall of rock on the other. Wet from mist, the stone was slick. Loose shale underfoot threatened every step. Cutter's confidence wavered immediately, muscles tense, eyes darting nervously. Elias observed silently. The first trap was subtle. A small patch of moss-covered stone, previously weakened, gave way under Cutter's weight. He stumbled, nearly losing balance. A cascade of gravel tumbled down the slope, striking nothing but echoing loudly through the ravine. Cutter flinched, gripping his rifle tighter, heart hammering. "You okay?" Elias asked softly. Cutter began, voice tight, but he stopped. Pride prevented him from admitting fear. "You must watch yourself," Elias continued. "The mountain does not forgive mistakes." Cutter nodded reluctantly. Every step forward was calculated, careful, exhausting. He had become a student of terrain whether he knew it or not. And Elias watched, the chain on his wrist rattling softly, a subtle reminder of the false freedom Cutter believed he still had. By midday, Cutter's fatigue was evident. Hunger gnawed at his stomach, though he refused to admit it. His muscles ached. His mind was consumed with frustration and fear. Every slope seemed steeper, every boulder more treacherous, every sound amplified by the stillness of the mountains. Elias led him deeper into the Smokies, always ahead, always calm. He guided Cutter past natural obstacles that would have been deadly to men untrained in the subtle signs of the land. A bent fern here, a displaced branch there, subtle cracks in the rock. Elias read them all. Cutter, meanwhile, stumbled, cursed, and corrected, unaware that the chain he carried was a symbol only of his dependence. The first physical confrontation came at a narrow gorge. The path was barely wide enough for one man. On either side, sheer cliffs fell into mist-shrouded depths. Elias paused, crouching near the edge, observing the slope below. The ground was unstable, stones loosened, waiting for a misstep. Cutter stepped forward, rifle in hand, chest heaving. "Keep moving," he barked. Elias raised a hand. "Careful, this is the dangerous section." "Dangerous?" Cutter snapped. "I can handle it, move out of my way." He stepped onto the weak ground. Gravel shifted underfoot. Stones rolled into the depths below. Cutter froze. Heart racing, sweat sliding down his face. One misstep and he would join the rocks tumbling into the valley. Elias did not move. He watched. He let Cutter face the mountain on his own terms. "You must be steady," Elias said softly. Cutter's teeth clenched. He forced himself forward, every muscle straining, every nerve alert. The ridge seemed endless. Every step required focus and precision, and Elias observed, calculating the next stage of the trap. By afternoon, Cutter was exhausted. He had survived falls, missteps, and the subtle terror of isolation. He had begun to distrust every sound, every shadow, every instinct. Hunger and fatigue made him jittery. Every nerve was on edge. Every step forward was measured and cautious, yet his mind wavered. The forest seemed to lean closer. Mist thickened, shadows shifted unnaturally. Even the wind carried a subtle menace, rattling branches and teasing the edge of visibility. Elias allowed Cutter to feel alone. The man's ego had been battered, but it still demanded authority. Elias did not correct him, did not intervene. He only waited. The forest, the mountain, and the traps themselves had become his allies. The final trap was set deliberately, in a narrow ravine. The path descended sharply. Loose shale, moss, wet roots, and fallen logs were scattered across the slope. The gorge funneled sound, amplifying every footstep, every exhalation, every curse. Mist clung to every surface, obscuring the depth and width of the ravine. Elias led Cutter to the top, pausing deliberately. "This is where many fall," he said softly. Cutter swallowed, hands gripping his rifle. "I won't fall." "Confidence is dangerous here," Elias replied. Cutter moved forward cautiously. Stones shifted beneath his boots. Gravel slid down the slope. A fallen branch rolled underfoot. He caught himself just in time. Heart racing, lungs burning. Every step a negotiation with the mountain itself. Elias followed closely, chain rattling softly, guiding Cutter's perception without revealing his own mastery. The gorge was a gauntlet. A misstep sent a shower of stones down the slope. Cutter flinched, arms raised to protect his face. Another slip sent him scraping against a boulder, bruising his shoulder. Every step forward was agony, both physically and mentally. Elias remained calm, silently calculating the next danger. He had studied the gorge, memorized every weak patch of rock, every unstable tree, every treacherous incline. Cutter did not know the ground he walked on, or the man who walked beside him. The mountain itself dictated the rhythm of the hunt now. Cutter was prey. By evening, Cutter reached a plateau at the end of the ravine. He was bloodied, bruised, and exhausted. His rifle was nearly useless from constant slipping and striking rocks. Hunger gnawed at his stomach. Fatigue weighed heavily on every muscle, and every nerve was frayed by the constant uncertainty and fear. Elias stood nearby, calm and silent, chain at his wrist. Cutter's eyes flicked to him. "You're still alive," he muttered, voice hoarse. "I've walked these mountains longer than you've lived," Elias said quietly. "They speak to me. They speak to you too if you listen, but you must know how to hear them." Cutter's lips pressed into a tight line. He wanted to lash out, to assert dominance, to regain control. But every instinct told him otherwise. He was too weak, too tired, too vulnerable. The realization settled like a stone in his gut. He was no longer in command. He had become prey. The forest closed in as night fell. Mist rolled down the ridges. The temperature dropped. Every sound was amplified. The drip of water, the rustle of leaves, the distant crash of stones. Cutter huddled near a small fire, trying to maintain warmth, though it offered little comfort. Elias observed silently. The man had survived every trap, but at a cost. Confidence shattered, pride battered, nerves frayed. Hunger and exhaustion had done what physical injury could not. Cutter was now entirely under Elias's control, and the mountain had done the rest. By dawn, Cutter had accepted his role. Not openly, not willingly, but instinctively. Every movement he made was cautious. Every glance over his shoulder betrayed fear. Every step forward was dictated by Elias's subtle guidance and the mountain's unforgiving landscape. The final reckoning was complete. The hunters had fallen into their own traps. The forest had won, and Elias, the man bound in iron yet free in mastery, stood as the undisputed force within the Smoky Mountains. The hunt was over, but survival, for Elias and for Cutter, had only just begun. The mountains held their silence. Fog lingered in hollows, curling around the trees like a living thing. Water trickled in hidden streams, the sound amplified in the quiet of the early morning. Birds were scarce, even the wind seemed hesitant, moving slowly through the spruce and pine. The forest had claimed the last of its victories. Elias moved carefully, feet whispering over wet leaves and moss-covered stones. His chain rattled softly at the wrist, a mockery of captivity that he had long since learned to ignore. Cutter followed behind, exhausted, bruised, bloodied, and silent. Every step he took was measured, fearful, controlled by both fatigue and the subtle guidance of the man he had once thought powerless. The Smokies had transformed him. The morning air was sharp with frost in the higher ridges. Cutter's hands shook as he adjusted his rifle strap, though he would not admit it. His pride had been battered nearly beyond repair. Hunger gnawed at him, and every muscle protested. He was alive, but only barely. Elias walked ahead, chest steady, eyes scanning the forest. He had led the hunters through traps, through fear, through exhaustion, and through isolation. By the fourth day, only Cutter remained. Wade, Hollis, Mark, and Miles were scattered, collapsed, or too injured to continue. The mountain had claimed them silently, imparting its lessons through pain and fatigue rather than violence. Elias allowed Cutter to walk behind him, a silent student of survival now. The irony was complete. The first part of the aftermath was practical, assessing the terrain and ensuring they could descend safely from the high ridges. Cutter's steps were slow, careful, almost tentative. "How far?" he began, but stopped, throat tight. Elias waited. There was no answer he would give immediately. Cutter did not ask again. He knew in the deep places of his mind that the answers were not coming from Elias, but from the mountain itself. Elias guided him along a path carved subtly into the ridges hidden from view, marked by bent ferns, slightly displaced rocks, and other signs only a man of experience could read. The chain at his wrist was irrelevant. The mountains dictated the path, and Cutter followed, learning it by instinct rather than choice. As they descended, the reality of what had occurred began to settle. The hunters who had followed with arrogance and cruelty were gone, broken by the forest and the subtle genius of Elias's planning. Cutter had seen their mistakes, their hesitations, their fights with one another, and he understood now that strength was worthless without patience and knowledge. Hollis's ankle had turned in the shale. Wade had been battered by the slopes. Mark and Miles were scattered, some hidden in small gullies, some too weak to move. All had survived only partially, carried by a desperate will rather than skill. And Cutter, walking behind Elias, felt a mixture of awe, frustration, and fear. He was alive because of Elias, but he could not admit it, even to himself. Pride demanded silence. Survival demanded obedience. The terrain grew more forgiving as they descended toward a low valley. The air grew warmer, damp but breathable, the fog thinning to a soft mist. Trees spread out, branches less threatening, moss giving way to soil and grass. Here the forest allowed a semblance of ease, though the lessons had already been learned. Elias stopped near a small spring. Clear water trickled from a stone basin, gurgling quietly. He knelt to drink, letting Cutter approach. The man hesitated, eyes scanning the tree line, hands still on his rifle, muscles tense. "You drink," Elias said softly, but only carefully. "Watch the ground, watch yourself." Even this is part of the lesson. Cutter obeyed, bending to scoop water. The cool stream was a relief to his parched throat. His body had been tested nearly beyond limits. Every bruise, every cut, every scrape told a story. The mountain had taught him, whether he wanted to learn or not. Elias remained vigilant, scanning the forest around them. He had taught Cutter the greatest lesson, that survival depended on knowledge, observation, and respect, not pride or violence. The next stage of the escape was subtle, leaving no trace for pursuers, ensuring that the path behind them erased itself in mist and leaf litter. Cutter followed silently. Elias led him along natural corridors, over gentle slopes, around fallen trees, and across hidden streams. Every step was deliberate. Gravel and leaves were shifted slightly to conceal footprints. Branches were repositioned. Moss and soil were disturbed just enough to erase signs of passage but leave subtle indicators that Elias alone could read. By nightfall, they reached a small clearing, sheltered by a copse of spruce. The fire they built was minimal, designed to warm, not signal. Cutter's exhaustion was complete. He collapsed against a tree, shivering, bruised, muscles aching. Elias remained at the edge of the clearing, watching the forest. He knew that the mountains had been generous in allowing Cutter to survive, but only because the man now carried the knowledge and the humility that the forest demanded. The aftermath was also psychological. Cutter sat silently, staring into the fire. He had been tested in ways he could scarcely articulate. He had survived falls, exhaustion, hunger, and the subtle manipulations of both man and forest. And yet, he knew that his survival was not a victory. It was a debt. Every step he had taken had been guided. Every misstep had been corrected. Every fear had been magnified, until he understood that arrogance and pride were worthless against knowledge and patience. You could have left me," Cutter said finally, voice rough, eyes avoiding Elias's gaze. "I could have," Elias replied simply. "But the mountain is patient. It teaches those willing to learn." Cutter said nothing. Pride prevented him from admitting gratitude, but in the quiet of the Smokies he understood it anyway. Elias allowed the man to rest, ensuring no sudden movements or errors would draw attention from the forest. Night fell, stars hidden behind clouds and mist, and the forest hummed softly. The next day, they began the final stage of the escape. Elias led Cutter to a hidden pass, one that descended gradually toward the lowlands. The path was natural, almost indistinguishable from the forest floor, but every subtle bend, every fallen tree, every stone had been noted and memorized by Elias. They would move unseen, untracked, past any potential pursuers. Cutter followed, silent, watching the man's movements carefully, learning despite himself. Each step reinforced the lesson. Arrogance had been his undoing, humility and observation his only salvation. As they descended, the forest opened gradually. Small streams became more visible. Light broke through gaps in the canopy. The air grew warmer, more breathable. The dangers of the high ridges and ravines were behind them. Elias paused at the edge of a small meadow. "From here the path is easy," he said. "But do not mistake ease for safety. The lesson is never complete. Always watch, always measure, always respect." Cutter nodded, still too exhausted to argue. He felt the weight of everything that had occurred, the fear, the exhaustion, the physical pain, the psychological pressure. The forest had tested him in ways he could not have anticipated. He had survived, but the mountain had claimed its lessons nonetheless. The final act of the escape was simple: separation. Elias led Cutter to the edge of the forest. Beyond it, low hills and cultivated land hinted at safety. The man's muscles trembled, his hands still on the rifle, but his mind had shifted. Fear and respect now guided him. He had survived, but he would never forget. Elias paused. "Go," he said quietly. "The lessons are yours now. Walk carefully, live carefully." Cutter looked at him, eyes wide with the weight of experience. He did not speak. He only nodded, understanding that survival had come at a cost, and that the mountain and the man had been both teachers and judges. Elias watched him disappear into the lowlands. Cutter moved slowly, carefully, each step deliberate. Once Cutter was gone, Elias turned back to the forest. The Smoky Mountains stretched endlessly, ridges and valleys rolling in quiet majesty. Mist lingered in hollows, streams trickled unseen, and the air was sharp and alive. The forest had been patient, it had been deliberate, it had been unforgiving, and it had been just. Elias lifted his head, listening. Every sound, every shift of wind, every subtle movement of wildlife was part of the language he had mastered. The mountains had always been home, and now, after 4 days of orchestrated chaos and careful manipulation, they had reaffirmed his dominion. Not through violence, but through knowledge, patience, and respect for the land. The chain at his wrist clinked softly as he removed it and let it fall to the forest floor. It was meaningless. The hunters had left. Survival had been achieved. The lessons had been learned. The mountains were patient, but they remembered. Elias walked deeper into the forest, mist curling around him, moving silently over the slopes he knew so well. The Smokies had tested him, taught him, and rewarded him, and in their quiet majesty he found freedom, not from men but from fear, ignorance, and weakness. The forest was alive, the mountains were patient, and Elias, bound only by the memory of chains, was at last truly free.